It was the specific sound of a $1,200 pair of Italian stilettos being swallowed by the earth that told me the war had truly begun, a wet, sucking noise that felt incredibly satisfying as I watched from my porch, coffee mug in hand. Witnessing the president of the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association realize that nature doesn't care about your net worth. Eleanor Sterling, a woman who treated the Geneva Convention like a suggestion box, stood ankle-deep in the muck of my shoreline, screaming about community assets, while 3 charter buses idled behind her, choking the crisp morning air with diesel fumes, offloading 40 strangers who thought they were about to fish in a public park, unaware they were trespassing on a 60-year-old promise I made to a dead man. She shrieked something about me being a selfish relic, her voice cracking under the weight of an audacity so pure it was almost impressive, but she had made the classic mistake of confusing silence for weakness, assuming that just because I was a retired electrician who liked his quiet, I didn't know how to strip a live wire without getting burned. To understand why a 52-year-old man would go to war over a patch of water, you have to understand the soil, the sweat, and the history buried under every inch of this 40-acre sanctuary, a place my grandpa Silas bought back in 1962 when it was nothing but scrub brush and a dream, spending 15 years of his life digging that 8-acre spring-fed lake by hand, laying every plank of the dock, carving our initials into the rough bark of the old oak tree that still stands. Sentinel, near the water's edge. I'm Arthur Vance, and for 3 decades I made my living in high-voltage industrial repair, a job that teaches you that if you smell smoke, you don't just fan the air, you trace the circuit back to the breaker, and you kill the power before the whole building burns down. When I sold my contracting firm and moved back home, I wanted peace. I wanted the smell of pine needles baking in the sun. I wanted to run my hands over the grooves in the wood where Grandpa Silas taught me that a man's property is his castle. But then the Oakwood Heights development sprang up like expensive fungus around my borders, 47 McMansions filled with retirees who thought lakefront lifestyle was something you could buy, not something you built. For a while, it was just uneasy coexistence, the kind where neighbors wave with one hand and check their property lines with the other, until Eleanor moved in 3 years ago, a 58-year-old real estate attorney from Los Angeles, with a white Mercedes G-Wagon she washed more often than she called her mother, and a legal pad she wielded like a loaded shotgun. She bullied her way into the HOA presidency within 6 months, terrorizing the neighborhood over the wrong shade of beige paint or garbage cans left out for an hour too long. But I wasn't part of her little kingdom. My deed predated her HOA by decades. I never signed her covenants, never agreed to her rules, and my lake was legally, morally, and spiritually mine. It started with a smile, the kind of predator smile that doesn't reach the eyes, when she approached my fence line claiming my lake was a mosquito breeding ground that was tanking property values, demanding I install a $15,000 filtration system to solve a problem that didn't exist because spring-fed water moves. It doesn't stagnate. I politely told her to kick rocks, explaining the hydrology like she was a child. But that was the moment the switch flipped, the moment she decided that I wasn't a neighbor, I was an obstacle, and within 48 hours the harassment began with the precision of a military campaign. Anonymous tips flooded the county health department. Inspectors named Miller showing up at dawn with clipboards and apologetic grimaces, testing water that was cleaner than the bottled stuff Eleanor drank, telling me, "Mr. Vance, this is ridiculous. Whoever reported this is either blind or lying." But Eleanor wasn't interested in the truth. She was interested in attrition. She stood over Inspector Miller like a prison warden, demanding second opinions, her face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson when the science didn't back up her lies. And that afternoon she escalated to certified mail, sending me a letter so dense with legal jargon it practically weighed 5 pounds, referencing watershed protection agreements and collective resource management obligations that I knew for a fact were hallucinations. But here's the thing about electricians. We are natural detectives. We spend our lives looking for the fault in the line, the corrosion in the connection. So when someone throws a wall of technical noise at you, you know they're trying to hide a structural failure. I started digging, not into the dirt, but into the data, spending hours at the county clerk's office, tracing Eleanor's history, and what I found was the first crack in her insulation. Her California law license was under review for misrepresentation of property rights. a polite way of saying she was a liar with a degree. I decided to fortify, installing 4K security cameras with cloud backup, replacing my polite, private property signs with aggressive legal notices citing specific state statutes about criminal trespass and fines, turning my home into a fortress of solitude. But the real shock came 3 days later when Inspector Miller called me, his voice lowered to a whisper, telling me that Eleanor had tried to slip him $2,000 cash in a consulting fee envelope to falsify the water report. Bribery of a government official is a felony, a heavy one. And suddenly this wasn't just a neighbor dispute anymore. It was a crime scene in slow motion. So I sat on the end of my dock that evening, watching the sunset bleed gold across the water, feeling the ghost of Grandpa Silas sitting next to me, realizing that Eleanor didn't just want to annoy me, she wanted to erase me. I pulled the property values for the neighborhood and saw the pattern immediately. Every house within a mile had spiked in value, except hers, because while the market was hot, Eleanor was drowning in debt, leveraged to the hilt with a second mortgage and a maxed-out home equity line. She wasn't fighting for the community, she was fighting for her financial life. If she could secure community access to my private lake, her property value would jump 20% overnight, enough to refinance, enough to save her drowning assets. She was trying to steal my legacy to pay for her mistakes. Her next move was a masterclass in manipulation, calling an emergency town hall at the Oakwood Heights clubhouse to discuss shared water resource management. A meeting I wasn't invited to but heard about from Mrs. Higgins, my 78-year-old neighbor who had a spine of steel and a hatred for bullies. I crashed that meeting, walking into the back of the room just as Eleanor was projecting a slide of a 1955 community fishing agreement, a document that looked official until you realized it mentioned environmental impact assessments that didn't exist as legal concepts until the 70s, and used a signature for Grandpa Silas that was clearly traced from a 1962 deed. I didn't shout, I didn't scream. I simply hooked my phone up to her projector and hijacked the presentation, displaying the original surveys, the construction photos, and a breakdown of her forged dates, pointing out that civilian GPS coordinates, which her fake document cited, weren't available until the 80s. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence where you can hear a reputation dying, and Eleanor's face went from smug to pale, drained of blood as I dissected her fraud in front of 50 of her constituents, exposing the forgery for the amateur hour that it was. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, hissing that she would file an injunction, that she would tie me up in court until I bled dry. And true to her word, the legal assault began the next morning. She hired a surveyor named Bob, the Bungler Jenkins, a man with a revoked license and a truck held together by duct tape, who produced a map claiming my lake actually belonged to the Watershed Trust, a map so geometrically impossible it required the lake to exist in the fourth dimension. Then came the trespassers, waves of them, strangers she had invited to test the access rights, wealthy friends from the city in pristine fishing gear, setting up picnics on my lawn, ignoring my signs, quoting Eleanor's lies about a pending court order allowing them access. I met them with printed notices of criminal trespass, photographing their license plates, turning on my motion-activated sprinkler system, which I had joyfully calibrated to hit the exact center of the dock, watching grown men in $300 vests run screaming from the icy blast of water. But while I was defending the perimeter, I was also on the offensive, hiring Diana West, a forensic surveyor who laughed out loud when she saw Bob Jenkins's map, writing a report that essentially called him a hallucinatory idiot. And I began to assemble a team because I knew Eleanor wasn't done. I knew she was desperate, and desperate people make fatal mistakes. I caught her at the county records office a week later. Unaware, I was watching from behind a stack of zoning maps, listening as she spoke on the phone, her voice carrying that frantic edge of someone watching the water rise above their nose. She was talking to a developer, pitching my land, my grandfather's land, as a luxury subdivision opportunity, promising them she could force a sale by driving the value down through litigation, explicitly stating that once she established community access, the old fool would sell just to escape the harassment. She mentioned tax liens from California, almost $400,000 owed to the state, admitting that if she didn't flip this deal in 60 days, she would lose everything, her license, her home, her freedom. Hearing Eleanor confess her endgame was like watching a schematic finally make sense. She wasn't just a nuisance. She was a predator caught in a bear trap of her own making, trying to chew through my leg to get free. I realized then that I couldn't just win this battle. I had to dismantle the entire machine. So I gathered my war council. Mrs. Higgins, who held 40 years of neighborhood gossip like a weaponized archive. My grandson Leo, an FAA-certified drone pilot who could fly a camera through a keyhole. Ethan Cole, an investigative journalist with a hunger for corruption stories. And Olivia Reed, a property rights attorney who looked at RICO statutes the way a starving wolf looks at a steak. We needed a trap, something irresistible, something that would force Eleanor to overplay her hand in front of undeniable witnesses. So I announced the Veterans Memorial Fishing Tournament, a massive event honoring Grandpa Silas's service, offering cash prizes and gear, knowing that Eleanor couldn't stand the idea of hundreds of people enjoying her lake without her permission. We set the stage with the precision of a controlled demolition, posting felony trespass warnings every 50 feet, coordinating with local news stations who thought they were coming for a fluff piece on veterans, and hiding high-definition cameras in the trees, the dock posts, even the birdhouses. The morning of the tournament was perfect. The lake was glass. Legitimate veterans were casting lines and sharing coffee, until the invasion force arrived. 3 charter buses led by Eleanor's gleaming SUV, rolling down my driveway like a Panzer division disguised in LL Bean catalogs. She stepped out, radiating that toxic mix of arrogance and desperation, directing 50 potential investors and cronies toward the water, loudly proclaiming that community rights superseded my private event, waving a manila folder filled with her forged injunctions like a shield. It was grotesque, watching these entitled strangers trample my grandfather's hydrangeas, dragging coolers and folding chairs onto the dock, pushing veterans aside, while Eleanor held court, giving guided tours to men in suits, pointing out where the condos would go, explicitly selling land she didn't own. Leo's drone buzzed silently overhead at 400 feet, capturing 4K footage of every boundary violation, every face, every transaction, while Ethan Cole's news crew captured the chaos from the ground, broadcasting live as the community leader turned a memorial into a flea market. I let it run for 20 minutes, letting her dig the hole deep enough to bury herself, before I signaled Detective Mike Henderson, an old friend from the fraud unit who had been fishing quietly in a hooded sweatshirt near the treeline. The look on Eleanor's face when Mike flipped his badge was worth every penny of legal fees I'd spent. She tried to pivot, claiming she was just an attorney representing the group, but Mike cornered her with simple questions she couldn't answer without incriminating herself. Are you a licensed real estate agent? No. Are these your clients? No. Do you have a signed deed? No. She crumbled, stammering. And then, in a moment of pure panic, she tried to pull rank, telling the detective that I was mentally unstable, that I was hoarding land that belonged to the public, admitting on police body cam that her goal was to force a sale for the greater good. Mike shut it down, ordering the buses to leave or face mass arrest, and as the trespassers fled, scattering like roaches under a kitchen light, Eleanor stood alone in the dust of their departure, realizing she had just confessed to real estate fraud in front of a cop and a news crew. But a wounded animal is most dangerous right before it dies, and Eleanor's retaliation was swift and vicious, a smear campaign that hit me where it hurt most. The next day, flyers appeared on every doorstep in Oakwood Heights, professionally printed, claiming I was a violent PTSD-ridden hermit stockpiling weapons, warning neighbors to keep their children away, fabricating stories about me threatening residents at gunpoint. She reported me to the VA, trying to get my disability benefits suspended pending a psychiatric evaluation, and she called my former electrical clients, whispering that I had lost my mind, destroying 30 years of professional reputation in an afternoon. It hurt, I won't lie, feeling the eyes of neighbors who used to wave now looking at me with fear, seeing mothers pull their kids closer when I drove by. But what Eleanor didn't know was that Olivia Reed, my shark of a lawyer, was building a RICO case, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, a federal statute usually reserved for the mob, but perfectly applicable to a coordinated scheme of wire fraud, mail fraud, and extortion. We needed one final nail, one undeniable proof of intent. and Eleanor provided it when she reached out to Councilwoman Baker, a local official she thought was corruptible, asking for a private dinner at the Gilded Lily to discuss eminent domain solutions. Councilwoman Baker was already working with the FBI. The dinner was a masterclass in hubris. Leo sat 2 tables away with a parabolic microphone, while Eleanor slid a heavy envelope across the tablecloth, offering $25,000 for the councilwoman's support in seizing my land. She laid it all out: the psychiatric hold strategy, the plan to have me committed to a facility so she could bypass the deed restrictions, the precise split of the profits from the development deal. She didn't just cross the line, she sprinted past it, detailing how she would destroy a man's life for a commission check. The audio was crystal clear, every syllable of her corruption preserved forever, capturing the sound of a soul completely eroded by greed. She honestly believed she was winning, that she was the smartest person in the room, unaware that the waiters were federal agents and the flower arrangement on her table contained a camera. She left that dinner glowing with triumph, heading straight to the annual HOA general meeting, the venue she had chosen for her final act, the place where she intended to strip me of my rights in front of the entire community. The clubhouse was packed that Saturday night, standing room only, the air thick with tension and the smell of cheap cologne. Eleanor took the stage in a $3,000 power suit, launching into a PowerPoint presentation that painted me as the Unabomber of the suburbs, displaying doctored photos of my property, fake police reports, and charts showing how my instability was costing everyone money. She introduced her star witness, a man introduced as Dr. Kevin Sterling, a forensic psychiatrist who stood at the podium and somberly diagnosed me, a man he had never met, with paranoid aggression and imminent violent tendencies, urging the community to support an emergency seizure of my property for public safety. The audience was captivated, nodding along in terrified agreement, ready to sign whatever petition she put in front of them to make the bad man go away. I waited until the doctor finished his grim prognosis. Then I stood up from the back row, not with anger, but with the heavy calm of a man holding the kill switch. Eleanor sneered, telling me this was a closed meeting, but I walked down the center aisle, unplugged her laptop from the HDMI cable, and plugged in my own. "Let's look at the real data," I said, my voice projecting without a microphone, and I hit the spacebar. The first slide wasn't a defense of my sanity. It was a PDF of Eleanor's California tax liens, $387,000 in unpaid debt. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of Eleanor's lungs. I clicked again. Slide 2. Her bar association disciplinary record, detailing the fraud charges she fled in Newport Beach. Slide 3. The employment records of Dr. Kevin Sterling, who was actually her unemployed brother-in-law, a man currently collecting welfare in Bakersfield, not a psychiatrist, but a failed actor with a history of petty theft. Eleanor tried to scream, tried to cut the power, but Mrs. Higgins and 2 other neighbors blocked her path to the AV cart. I played the audio file then, the recording from the Gilded Lily, her voice booming through the clubhouse speakers, clear and undeniable. A quick psychiatric hold. This problem disappears forever. I get the commission on a $3 million flip. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, the sound of a worldview shattering for 200 people who realized they had been the pawns in a criminal's game. That's when the doors at the back of the hall burst open, not for dramatic effect, but because the FBI doesn't knock when they have a warrant for conspiracy to commit kidnapping and federal wire fraud. Special Agent Martinez walked in, flanking Eleanor before she could even reach for her purse, the metallic click of handcuffs cutting through the room like a gavel strike. As they marched her out, past the neighbors she had lied to, past the veterans she had disrespected, past the doctor brother-in-law who was currently wetting his pants as a deputy cuffed him, she looked at me with eyes full of hate, and I just raised my coffee cup in a silent toast. The fallout was nuclear. Eleanor pleaded guilty to 14 federal counts to avoid a trial that would have humiliated her further. She got 10 years in federal prison, restitution that seized every asset she had including the G-Wagon and the house, and permanent disbarment. Her brother-in-law got 4 years for perjury and fraud. The HOA board resigned in disgrace that same night, and Mrs. Higgins was elected president by unanimous acclaim, immediately passing new bylaws that enshrined property rights, and issued a formal apology to my family. But the real closure didn't come from the courtroom. It came 6 months later, sitting on the dock with Leo, watching a group of disabled veterans fishing from the new accessible platform we built with the settlement money. The air smelled of barbecue and pine, not diesel and desperation. My reputation was restored, my property value soared. Ironically, because the neighborhood was now famous for being a fortress of property rights. But more importantly, the lake was peaceful again. We established the Silas Vance Memorial Scholarship for Environmental Science, turning the legacy of the lake into a future for kids who actually cared about the land. Eleanor wanted to steal a legacy to pay for her greed, but she ended up cementing it, ensuring that this water would remain a sanctuary long after we're both gone. It makes you wonder, though, about the nature of justice. Was it right to let her go so far, to let her commit so many crimes just to ensure the trap snapped shut? Or is that the only way to deal with a bully? To let them throw the punch so you can finally knock them out? Eleanor is sitting in a cell, and I'm sitting here watching the sun dip below the tree line, hearing the laughter of families who finally understand that a neighborhood isn't about rules, it's about respect. Justice, like a good electrical circuit, eventually finds the path of least resistance, straight to the truth. What would you do if someone tried to gaslight an entire town to steal your family's history? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe, because next week, we're talking about the time a neighbor tried to claim he owned the airspace over my driveway. Stay safe and protect your ground.